What is going on in Canadian politics? Why are the Liberals rising so much? And what the hell is happening to the NDP? Couple of housekeeping notes first. There are timestamps in the description and on the video bar, so if you want to skip to a certain type of discussion, you can just click there. Number two, this is not a gun-related video. Yes, it is related to guns in that the outcome of the next election is the most important for gun owners in Canada ever, but it's not directly related to guns. We're not talking about party policies right now. We're just going to be talking about polling support and what that means for who might win the next election. And number three, polls in general. Polling in Canada has historically been very good. I'm not going to fight you on this. If you don't believe in polls, then you should just click off this video because I'm not going to be changing your mind in any way whatsoever. And you may as well just spend your time better, enjoy your life a different way. I believe in the polling that Canada is doing right now, or that is being done in Canada, because it has historically been very accurate. With the exception of ECOS. I will not be using any ECOS polling because they are truly shit. So, with that out of the way, what the hell is happening? As you can see in front of you, this is a graph showing the position of where parties were polled since the last election. This is not an aggregate of polls, so there is no softening support. It's not showing the aggregate taking into account the last month or two. This is a very reactionary graph, but it serves to illustrate the point of things are changing fast. And so I'm going to take you through a few of the polls from recent times and show you what is happening with these dots. First, let's start with Ipsos. Ipsos has the Conservatives at 41, the Liberals at 28, and the NDP at 16. Then we go to Palace. They have the Conservatives at 40%, the Liberals at 34%, and the NDP at 12%. Then we go to Innovative. Innovative is much like Ipsos, 40% Conservative, 27 Liberal, 16 NDP. Then we move to Léger. This was the first of the oh shit polls. Against Trudeau, very similar, 14 NDP, 40 Conservatives, 31 Liberal. When polled with Carney, the Liberals are at 37, the Conservatives are at 37, the NDP is at 12. Abacus. They are very different from every other pollster. They have the Conservatives at 46%, the Liberals at 27%, and the NDP at 15%. They are the only ones that have seen a rise in Conservative support over the last week and a half. Now, the generic Main Street ballot has the Conservatives at 39%, the Liberals at 36%, and the NDP at 11%. But if we go down in the Main Street poll and we look at Carney, the Liberals are at 40%, the Liberals at 37%, and the NDP at 12%. Now let's look at Nanos. Nanos has a bit of a paywall, so I can't really show you much more than this. Conservatives at 39%, Liberals at 32%, NDP at 15%. Then we look at Angus Reid. This one just came out today, and it is terrifying. With Carney as leader, 40% for the Conservatives, 37% for the Liberals, 10% for the NDP. So that brings us back to this page. So now you can see what these dots are and what they represent. Now, importantly, the Angus Reid one that I showed you is not on this graph yet. Just pretend it's here somewhere. It would be somewhere in this little cluster of dots in the middle between the two lines. But that is where all of these little dots and the sharp increase and decreases in lines are coming from. So what the hell is going on here? Why is this so sharp? Well, a few things are happening. Number one, the Conservatives have lost anywhere between 2 and 5% of their support. It's not a large amount of support. In fact, this kind of support, the 2 and 5%, is very likely just anti-Trudeau Liberals that could stomach voting the Conservatives more than they could the NDP. And now that Trudeau is gone, they're happy to return to the Liberals. This group was almost certainly never going to vote for the Conservatives. Even if Trudeau stayed on as leader, they probably just wouldn't have gone out to vote. So that's not really too much to worry about. As we saw from the polls, the Conservatives are still around 38 to 42% in the polls on average, and that is more than good enough for a majority in almost every other election. But maybe not this next one. And that's because number two, NDP support is absolutely cratering. The NDP is losing all of their anti-conservative vote back to the Liberals. That is where this sharp increase is primarily coming. If we assume 3% are coming from the Conservatives to the Liberals, we can assume another 5 to 10% are coming from the NDP to the Liberals. That's where that 15% jump is coming from. It is almost all due to the NDP absolutely collapsing. But it's happening in very specific places. And I'm going to take you through some of the graphs again to show you what's happening. Now, I can't show you every single graph because some of them are paywalled, and so I can't see the provincial numbers because those are paywalled, but on the ones that I can, I will show you. Taking a look at Palace, we can see that the Liberals have recovered a fair bit in BC, but the Conservatives still have a lead. The NDP has dropped a significant portion. Typically, in BC, it is about 30-30-30, generally. And any variation from the 30-30-30 will show that one party is doing good, bad, or terrible. And as you can see, the NDP is doing really terrible right now. Conservatives are still doing pretty good. The Liberals have rebounded, primarily eating up that NDP number. We're going to skip the prairies because they are basically always conservative. Ontario. This is the one that you should look out for when we're going through these graphs. Ontario has become a horse race, and that is very dangerous for the Conservatives. Previously, in almost all of the polls, the Conservatives were around 40 to 50% in Ontario, and they're still about there. But what's happened is that the NDP has cratered down to below 15%, and the Liberals have picked up the rest of the vote share, which is why it is becoming much more competitive on Ontario in a lot of these polls. So keep an eye out for that. Quebec has also changed. Conservative vote has basically not changed in Quebec at all. People were very iffy on where the Conservatives were in Quebec, but on average, they were around 23 to 26% in Quebec. So they might have dropped a tiny bit, but it's barely noticeable and it's entirely within the margin of error. What's outside the margin of error is the Bloc collapse and the Liberal rise. The Liberals were around the same as the Conservatives, on average 22 to 26%. They are now well above 30% in basically every poll. And the Bloc has collapsed from near 40s to around 30%. Looking at Innovative's poll, we can see Ontario, again, it's not quite as dramatic as the other ones. Conservatives still in the 40 range. Liberals up to the 30 range, so they're still up from where they were before. NDP down, but not by a crazy amount. This is the best poll for the NDP in this whole group. Now we're taking a look at Léger. If we look at Léger in Ontario, Liberals at 40, Conservatives at 39, NDP at 11%. And while we're here, let's also look at Quebec. 20% for the Conservatives, 40% for the Liberals, 9% for the NDP, and 25% for the Bloc. And now let's look at Angus Reid. Angus Reid has the NDP at 6% in Ontario, 45% Conservative, 44% Liberal. In Quebec, Conservatives, again, at around the 22%, the Bloc all the way down to 30%, NDP 8%, and Liberals 31%. So when we're looking at this graph, we can say, all right, the vote shift is primarily happening in Ontario. It is primarily because the NDP is collapsing in Ontario. We can also say that it's a little bit to do with the Liberal rise in Quebec and the slight drop for the Bloc in Quebec. We can also say, thirdly, and the least importantly, the NDP is cratering a little bit in BC, and most of that support is going to the Liberals. But one other thing we can take from looking at all of the polling on a provincial level is that the Conservatives aren't really moving, as I discussed earlier, right? There's a bit of a drop, but it's not really much of a drop at all. And in a vacuum, the Conservatives would absolutely love to take being in the 40s in Ontario and the 40s in BC. They would love that. But what's making it different is the NDP collapse. So, why is this happening? Why are we seeing such a major shift in Ontario specifically, but a little bit elsewhere around the province? And the main reason for that is Trump. Now, I want to take a look at Abacus's poll. Now, while Abacus was very good for the Conservatives, I don't actually want to look at the vote intention for Abacus specifically here. I want to look at this, the top issues being faced. The number one issue is still the rising cost of living. And that's unsurprising. That's what motivates a lot of people. That's what's caused the Conservatives to jump high up in the polls. But what's number two is Trump and his tariffs. Due to Trump's economic illiteracy and his threat of tariffs, This has sent the Canadian anti-Americanism zooming. Now, why is Trump and his tariffs such a big deal for a lot of Canadians? Well, you can take a look at the video that I posted a little bit ago talking about how the tariffs will affect the Canadian gun industry. And it would have a pretty big effect, but nowhere near as big of an effect as some other parts of Canada, specifically the auto industry and energy industry and lumber industry. Those parts, if faced tariffs, would send a lot of people into joblessness and would have a major impact on our economy. It's a trade war. Trade wars have major impacts on economies. And the auto sector specifically is a very big issue for Ontario. And so it's not surprising that a lot of the left-leaning people in Ontario are rallying around a left-leaning leader who they believe is best handled to counter Trump. Because that's the thing. A lot of people in Ontario, left-leaning, specifically older people, believe that Carney is best to tackle Trump right now. And we can actually look to Angus Reid to show this. This graph from Angus Reid shows how the Liberals under Mark Carney are trusted with the economy and with relations to the US, including tariffs. Now, I know this is psychotic, but that's what people in Ontario are feeling right now. Now, this is for all of Canada, but this is primarily driven by Ontario, as we've gone over. So if we go back to this graph, are we saying that what we're seeing right now is a rally around the flag effect? I feel confident in saying that is what we're seeing. And the reason I feel confident in saying that is because Mark Carney has barely done any Canadian media. He's doing some tours like Pierre did, and they're also expensive depending on which ones you go to. So it's not like he's gotten his message out broadly speaking. But what has happened is that his name has been in the news, and people see that he's not Trudeau, and people see that the Liberals are currently in power, and people see that Trump is threatening Canadian industry and Canadian sovereignty, and people are rallying around the flag. But the people that are rallying around the flag are almost all left-wing people. If you look at this graph, you could say the right-wing people are rallying around the conservative flag, and the left-wing people are rallying around the liberal flag, setting us up for a two-party election. So when was the last time there was a rally around the flag effect in Canada? Well, we can look to 2021. This is the pre-election polling for 2021. As we can see, COVID kicked off and a whole bunch of people went to the Liberals. Now, differently from what's happening now, the Liberal bump that they got was a combination of support from both NDP and Conservative votes. And the gap lasted for a good few months until it eventually started to wind much closer when there was a bunch of scandals, as is very common with this Liberal government. And eventually, as we know, in the 2021 election, the Liberals won a minority government, and the Conservatives actually won the popular vote by 1%. You can say that the rally around the flag effect doesn't actually really last that long, and in an election, it really doesn't last. Another way to look at it is looking at what happened in 1984 and 1993. In 1983, Brian Mulroney became the leader of the Progressive Conservatives, who were seeing a decently sized lead in the polls. And following his election, he saw a massive lead in the polls. He was up to 62%. Then Pierre Elliott Trudeau resigned in 1984, and the polls tightened a fair bit. In fact, one of them showed the Liberals leading. And then John Turner became Prime Minister, and the Liberals were leading across the board. And then the election was called. The first poll had the Liberals still leading, and then the debate happened and the campaign went on, and John Turner got crushed, leading to one of the biggest election victories in Canadian history. Now let's take a look at the 1993 election. Since 1991, the Liberals had been polling very well. The Brian Mulroney government was unpopular, and it was only a matter of time until he left. He left in 1993, and the polls started to close up a bit, right? We're seeing a few leads for the Conservatives in some of the polls. Even if they're not leading, they're getting a lot closer. Sounds familiar. Then Kim Campbell becomes Prime Minister, and the closeness of the polls kind of stays. They're not really leading in many of them, but the polls are tight. And then we get to the election. And Kim Campbell is still right in tight with the Liberals until about halfway through, where everything falls off a cliff and the PCs end up with 16% and the Liberals with 41%. If you want that in graph form, here it is. Essentially, Kim Campbell, Brian Mulroney leaves, Kim Campbell elected somewhere around here, do well right until the writ is called, and then the writ is called and things go downhill fast. But there's something important you need to see in both of these scenarios. The party that absolutely collapsed after having decent polling lost a lot of their vote to other parties. It wasn't because the ideology collapsed per se, it was because the belief in the party collapsed. And in 1993, it was two parties. It was the Bloc and it was Reform. The Bloc was a split off of the Quebec Conservative Caucus, and Reform was a split off of the Western Conservative Caucus, leaving the PCs essentially isolated to Ontario and the Atlantic. And that is why the Liberals won such a huge majority here. And if we take a look at 1994, we can see a kind of similar thing happening. As we can see, the Conservatives were polling pretty well, but the Liberals were actually losing a lot of their support to the NDP. The NDP was around the 20s in 1982, and then as the election drew closer, as Mulroney came in, as Trudeau stepped down, we can see that the NDP vote collapsed, and it went all to the Liberals, especially after Turner became Prime Minister. And when we look at the polling during the election period, the NDP was on life support. But come to the end of the election, a lot of people left the Liberals and went back to the NDP. And so that brings us back to this graph. Is what we're seeing here a new leader bump or a get rid of the leader bump? I think you could also make that argument that right now what we're seeing is everyone who hated Trudeau is just returning, and it's just a temporary bump. And when the election starts, a lot of the support is going to bleed off. But there's a problem with that argument. The party that would theoretically be the one to pick up the anti-conservative vote is the NDP. But the NDP is uniquely incompetent right now. Because the NDP tied themselves so closely to Trudeau's Liberals, it's not that much of a stretch to say that Singh is closer to Trudeau than Carney is to Trudeau. And that's saying something because Carney has actually been helping Trudeau since 2020. And in the eyes of a lot of voters, Jagmeet Singh is the Trudeau vote, which explains why he's so low. So if they're not going to the NDP, where the hell are these people going if the Liberals collapse during an election? Well, there's three options. Either they don't show up to vote, meaning that the Liberal vote share automatically just goes down and the Conservative vote share goes up, which I do think is a real possibility. Number two is that those 3 to 5% that left the Conservatives in the last month or so return back to the Conservatives. I don't see this as too likely in my opinion, especially because Carney is copying a lot of Poilievre's policies. And so they're going to be easily tricked. If they've already moved, they're already easily tricked into believing Carney. So they're probably not coming back. Where they probably are going to go, and what will probably hamper Liberal success, is in Quebec. Now, as we looked at, Quebec is seeing the Bloc drop. But I don't think that's going to last. Carney's French is not very good. It's okay. In a prepared speech, it's fine. But the general consensus is that it's not very good. And in a debate, when you're not very good at your language on an off-the-cuff basis, you're going to struggle. Pierre and Blanchette's French is excellent. Obviously, Blanchette's is because he's the leader of the Bloc. But their French is very good, and they can argue in French. I don't believe Carney can. And so when the French debate kicks off, I think we're going to see a rise in the Bloc. I think a lot of the votes that swung from the Bloc to the Liberals are going to swing back to the Bloc because a lot of Quebec people are going to be looking at it like, oh, this guy isn't really that good for Quebec, at least in comparison to the Bloc. The only caveat in this is that if those same people are highly patriotic, as in Canada first, not Quebec first, and Trump is continuing with tariffs, it's possible that these people are not going to return to the Bloc, even if his French is terrible. You never know, right? We'll have to wait and see. But I do think that the Bloc is going to regain support during an election. So putting all of this together, what does this mean for the outcome of the election? Well, it means that the Conservative supermajority is almost guaranteed off the table. I don't believe it's possible for the Conservatives to get over 250 seats anymore. I don't believe it's possible to get over 230 seats. The conditions to allow that to happen just aren't there anymore. Do I think the Conservatives are going to lose the next election? I don't think so. And the reason I don't think so is because I think in an election, Carney is going to struggle badly, and I think the attack ads against him are going to be very potent. And as well, as I mentioned, I think his French is really going to hold him back in Quebec during an election campaign. The government that the Conservatives win, I think, is going to be very close to a minority or maybe even a minority. And the reason I think the Conservative seat share is going to be on a knife's edge between a minority and a majority is because of Ontario. A large part of the Canadian identity is built off of anti-Americanism, going right back to the founding of Canada. And it's especially prevalent in Ontario, which historically makes sense. And so Trump doing all of these tariffs and threatening Canadian sovereignty, it has awakened the anti-Americanism in a lot of Ontarians. And the anti-Americanism that has been awoken is causing a rally around the flag effect on both the Conservatives and the Liberals. One for the right wing, one for the left wing. And I can't see that changing. Even if Trump were to come out tomorrow and say, I'm taking tariffs off every country in the world, I don't think it changes the rally around the flag effect in Ontario. Anti-Americanism is so powerful in Canadian politics that it takes years for that kind of momentum to drop. And so when will this election be? How long do we have to wait? And how long do we have to deal with this? The rumor is that Carney is going to call an election right when he gets elected, which would put the election at late April, mid to late April, or early May. And so while we're not going to have to wait that long for an election to happen, it's going to be a rough couple of months for Conservative supporters. The Conservatives have a good shot of winning the next election, especially if they campaign properly during the next election. But a lot of it is, quite frankly, out of their hands because the NDP is that awful. If you made it through this video, thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something or gained a different perspective on what's going on. I will be going back to the firearms content next week. I have a lot of good stuff planned, but I hope you enjoyed. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.